I want to first mention that this Zoom is sponsored by the Lithuanian community of British Columbia. This is an organization that has its roots in the post-war period when waves of immigrants from Lithuania arrived after World War II and began to establish a community here. Right now, we're a strong ongoing organization across British Columbia, Canada, with a wide roster of members and a wide roster of activities that range from hiking and sports all the way to Lithuanian holidays, opportunities for kids and their families, and educational panels and discussions such as this one. I'd like to start by introducing the two speakers then. So we'll start with Sergei Yekelchuk, professor at the University of Victoria in Canada. Sergei was born and educated in Ukraine when it was part of the Soviet Union. He received a PhD from University of Alberta and is the author of 7 books, renowned books, excellent books in my view, on the history and politics of Ukraine, of Stalinism and relations between Russia and Ukraine. One book that I highly recommend to you is being prepared in a new edition on Ukraine, a more popular paperback that is really a good introduction to current issues. Now, it's also involved in the professor of history and Slavic studies, as I mentioned, at University of Victoria, and is current president of the Canadian Association for Ukrainian Studies. That book that I recommend to you is called Ukraine, What Everyone Needs to Know. I want to now introduce our next speaker, Rimas Ališauskas. Rimas is Deputy Defense Advisor in the Lithuanian delegation to NATO, representing the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense in defense planning and in policy NATO committees. He spent almost 20 years in the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense, working in different positions from international cooperation to defense planning. Although formulation of Lithuanian policies towards NATO was always at the center of his career in the Ministry of Defense. He drafted national security strategy, national military strategy, and a white paper for defense policy. He's a graduate of the Institute of International Relations and Political Science, Vilnius University, with a bachelor's degree in political science and master's degree in European studies. And so we will start with Sergei, who will provide a background based on Russia's attack on Ukraine and what the implications are for not just the Baltic region, but all of Eastern Europe. So if I could hand the floor over to Sergei Yekelchuk. Thanks, Sergei.
Thank you very much, Gene, for your generous introduction. Today, I'm going to talk very briefly about the Russian war in Ukraine and the implications for Europe more generally. It is really important to understand that most of the Western world thought, perhaps still thinks, that the war started on February 24th, 2022. But of course, those of us who are watching the events in the region, those of us who are from the region, and other countries of the region of East Central Europe and Northern Europe realize perfectly well. The war has started in 2014, really. And it has been going on without being really noticed all that much by Western media for 8 years before the full-scale Russian assault. In this picture, of course, we realize right away that Mr. Putin did not start a new conflict. He escalated significantly the pre-existing conflict. And that puts in a new light his intentions and Russia's strategy there. And of course, when looking at the region more generally, we also realize that Ukraine was selected as a target, as a victim, for a variety of reasons that include historical and cultural claims by Mr. Putin's Russia, but also the fact that in Ukraine, Mr. Putin could claim that he was fighting against NATO. This is indeed the central claim of the Russian media. And those Russian citizens who fully believe state-run media, and I'm sure there is a very significant share of such Russian citizens, they believe that they are not fighting against Ukraine at all, but rather they're defending Russia against NATO aggression. That's an official line that NATO had wanted to attack us through Ukraine, but we actually attacked defensively a few days before them. That's the official line of the Russian media and the Mr. Putin's government. Therefore, it is not really a conflict with Ukraine at all. It is presented as existential battle with the West, more generally. And when you see things in this light, and also when we consider the fact that this is not a new war, but an escalation of the war which had been going on, that basically makes us think about what is Mr. Putin's next move. If it is an existential battle, as he says, he cannot really afford to lose it. He cannot even afford to conclude a truce, a ceasefire, really, because all of that would be seen as him losing his face. And so, for him, subsequent escalation is probably the only viable way forward which would keep him at the helm, because otherwise, while he loses his face, he would perhaps be overthrown by more right-wing Russian military leadership before any democratic movement in Russia gets some traction. And so in this light, then, Ukraine is fighting for more than its own territory. It's fighting for greater security of East Central Europe, including Northern Europe, for the entire Western world. This understanding we see very clearly among our friends and allies, in particular among the Baltic states. Lithuania had served for a long time as an example for Ukrainians. Once we had been part of the same state, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And of course, in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, Lithuania served as an example of fighting against the empire for Ukrainians. There were rallies organized in Ukraine in support of Lithuania, which were trying to influence the decisions by the then Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. There's a long friendship there, and there is a long understanding as friends and neighbors. And most importantly, this is also a situation when friends and neighbors understand the real dimensions of the conflict and the real designs of the Russian government and just how desperate Mr. Putin is. And therefore, it's wonderful that the NATO summit is going to take place in Vilnius, and the Ukrainian media, the Ukrainian government is discussing, that is number one topic in Ukrainian press, the expected decisions to be made in Vilnius about the future relationship between Ukraine and NATO. What kind of promises, what kind of perhaps accession path, what kind of elevated level of support will be proposed, will be given to Ukraine at the Vilnius summit. So the significance of that is fairly obvious. And of course, there is also an issue of NATO's responsibility, because if Mr. Putin says, and if his domestic audience believes that this is really Russia's existential war against NATO, NATO cannot, remain silent. It is in a situation in which it has been brought into conflict already by Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin is on a spiral of escalating his actions. He is unpredictable. And there needs to be a very serious planning done ahead, both in terms of how Ukraine in the future would maintain close relationship with NATO, and of course in terms of what NATO itself right now needs to be planning for in light of Mr. Putin's subsequent actions. Mr. Putin knows very well, for instance, the traditional NATO strategy of not protecting the Baltic states, but rather accepting a possible annexation of the Baltic states and subsequently fighting back to restore their sovereignty. The infamous NATO doctrine of, I think, 180 days, accepting that the Russian army would take over the territory, but eventually NATO would be able to restore the sovereignty of the Baltic states. And the big question, of course, is whether this strategy is acceptable today in light of the war in Ukraine. So there are issues for NATO also in regard of what happens if Mr. Putin, for instance, decides to attack, let's say, Latvia or Lithuania. So it's a big moment. Ukrainians are waiting. The entire country is holding its breath, waiting for the word from Vilnius. And that's about all I wanted to say. Thank you so much for your support.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for your introductory comments. I'm glad that you mentioned, Sergei, the upcoming NATO meeting, which will be held next month in July 2023 in Vilnius, Lithuania. And definitely it seems that the question of future Ukrainian membership in NATO will be on the agenda. So I appreciate you providing the background and the implications for Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia as well. These areas have been under threat. Last year, there were a series of digital interruptions and digital disruptions in Lithuania by Russia-linked groups trying to undo the digital network of Lithuania. Previously, that had been done in Estonia, as I understand it. And then there were a series of bomb threats as well during that time. So I would like to hand it over to Rimas, who will talk about Lithuania's presence within NATO, as outlined when I read his biography a little while ago. So can you let us know the defense and security issues or presence in Lithuania at this time? Rimas?
Thank you. Labas rytas and good morning to everyone. First of all, I would say, confirm to Sergei that this friendship and support to Ukraine is mutual. It's both sides from Ukraine and from Baltic states, from Lithuania as well. It's not only rational, because it's rational, we need to be together when faced with the threat, but also at emotional level as well. If you just go to Vilnius and you will feel all the emotions, all the flags, you feel the atmosphere and the famous sign on Vilnius municipality put in Hague is waiting you. I know that my colleagues from NATO committee, when they were present in Vilnius last year, they were astonished, and we've been in hotel having ice-breaking party and making photos in front of the sign, because both skyscrapers were standing to each other. So yes, I'm more practitioner than scientist, so I will be my briefing will be a little bit different. And just a teaser, I will try to answer a question: when will there be a war in Lithuania and the Baltic states? So let's start from the basic assumptions, because we always need to look at the problem by starting on assumptions. That Russia is and will continue to be an empire. That's a reality. This assumption is based on the recent 500, the history of recent 500 years, and the last 20 years is a perfect demonstration, starting from war in Georgia and ending by really lasting aggression against Ukraine. Second, Baltic states, as well as Ukraine, are treated in Russia as lost territories. So not so much, of course, to gain but still occupation of free Baltic states would improve Russia's geostrategic situation, and that's a reality. And to quote Putin, Russia's borders never end. So that's we should have no illusions about Russian long-term intent. Actually, all the neighbors must be ready, not only Ukraine and Baltic states. And that means that Russia will remain a long-term threat, and the only existential, I would say, threat to Lithuania and the rest of the Baltic states. It's a long-term problem. But looking from strategic perspective, it doesn't mean that Lithuania or other Baltic states are an easy prey for Russia. You know, like first of all, Lithuania and Baltic states, contrary to Ukraine, are full-fledged members of NATO, covered by Article 5 guarantees. So no one attack against one ally is against all, and NATO is more or less most successful or most powerful alliance in the history. Second, Baltic states and other neighboring countries are rapidly expanding defense capacity, and we are increasing our ability to defend even nationally. And the last time it took 10 years for Stalin to quell resistance in Lithuania after World War II. So we should have no illusions that Lithuania will not resist. Putin made the wrong assumption in Ukraine that Ukrainians will not resist somehow, but he had perhaps, looking from Russian perspective, some arguments why. I would say that in Baltic states, he even doesn't have such arguments. So we should not make a wrong assumption. So looking from Russian perspective, any military adventure in the Baltic states would be extremely costly and likely trigger a major war that Russia could not win. So it's not an easy issue looking from Russian perspective. Now I would like to speak a little bit more about the regional outlook, about the military problem we face in Lithuania, and what military problem NATO faces, and what is the how it's viewed not only from NATO perspective but also from Russian perspective. So yeah, I think I cannot, unfortunately, somehow I cannot share the screen, but I hopefully everybody knows where Lithuania is, and where Kaliningrad is, and everybody knows the small strip between Belarus and Kaliningrad, which is basically called Suwalki corridor or gap. It's a gap from Russian perspective. It's making gap between Kaliningrad and Belarus, which is Russia's ally. And a corridor from NATO perspective, a corridor to ensure reinforcements in case Baltic states are under attack. Second problem of this part of regional problem is that NATO will always face time and distance gap in the Baltic states. For Russia, simply Baltic states are closer than for many NATO allies. So in theory and in practice, Russia could bring faster and more forces to the battlefield in the beginning of the conflict, and they try to do it in exercises, in Zapad exercises, and other exercises they train regularly. Finally, contrary to Ukraine, Baltic states has no strategic depth. We are small countries. Ukraine can still fight despite the fact that large swathes of its territory are occupied by Russia. Of course, they can reach other parts by long-range fires, missiles, but still it would be not the same in Lithuania, for example, when Vilnius is just 30 kilometers from Belarus. So it's an issue, it's a problem. So hence, from Russian military perspective, and the aim in the conflict would be to block Baltic states through, Kaliningrad gap, and to quickly achieve fait accompli. For NATO, it's vice versa, to ensure timely reinforcements of the Baltic states, and then to rely on overall military advantage against Russia, because I think we still all believe that NATO is conventionally military, is a stronger alliance as Russia alone. So Russia could win only if it achieves its aims quickly, and the protracted war against NATO most probably would lead to the defeat of Russia. Of course, all these judgments are and investigations is a little bit simplified, but I just wanted to present what's the problem with everybody to understand. And I would say that this problem drives both our national defense strategy and also, fortunately, thanks to Putin, it's more and more important driver of NATO strategy. I would say that these static factors existed even before war in Ukraine. It's more or less, you can't change the geography. But now I would like to touch upon a little bit on the red picture, what has changed in light of Russian aggression in Ukraine. So first thing I would like to mention is Belarus factor. So in the recent couple of years, Belarus de facto has become a Russian military district, losing the remains of its sovereignty. Russia, as you all know, used freely Russia used freely Belarusian territory to attack Ukraine from air and land. Although Belarusian troops didn't participate in war directly, but provided all the necessary host nation support, logistic support, and basically enabled the attack against Kiev. And also Russian military presence over the last years in Belarus increased. They have different types of capabilities there. Numbers fluctuate. They had just 7,000 troops a few months ago, now a little bit less, but definitely it's a very negative factor for Lithuania. Belarus is no longer a buffer zone between mainland Russia and Lithuania. Second factor is that Russia indeed lost significant part of its military capabilities in Ukraine, especially in the land domain. Thousands of experienced junior officers, sophisticated military equipment, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, etc. Besides, Russia and its army has suffered a psychological blow. The second army, they call each other, themselves, like a second army in the world. They could not win against Ukraine, and even was defeated around Kiev, Kharkiv, and Kherson. So to some extent, some could even argue that in terms of capabilities, Russia posed a bigger threat to Lithuania and NATO even before war, because they had very trained professional armed forces, and now they are changing part of professionals by not so well-trained, mobilized reservists, basically. But of course, we should not take Russia lightly. This crisis demonstrated that Russia is very eager to use military force to achieve its aims, and the threshold of the decision to use military force, it's very low, and indeed they are prone to risk, and they are ready to gamble, actually. And we should not exaggerate Russian losses. Its Navy and Air Force more or less have remained intact. They lost dozens of aircraft, and Black Sea flagman Moskva, well-known fact, but all these losses did not degrade dramatically its air and Navy power. If you look, for example, in Kaliningrad, so nothing has changed in there and Navy. Some changes, of course, in land domain, because lots of Russian troops from Kaliningrad were deployed to Ukraine, but they even reinforced air domain. And also, we should. Our assumption is that Russia will reconstitute its military capabilities as soon as possible. They could go even further. For example, last December, Russian Defense Minister Shoigu declared ambitious plans to increase Russian armed forces by 350,000 troops, create 3 new divisions, transform 7 brigades into divisions by 2026. This terms, of course, perhaps not very realistic, especially if Western sanctions will remain. However, taking into account how much they control the Russian society, how much Russian society could suffer, how much militarized Russia is everything is possible, perhaps in a little bit longer perspective. And these reforms, it's assessed by our intelligence that these reforms would enhance Russian military capabilities in Western direction by 30 to 50%. And it's obvious that Russia is preparing for long-term confrontation with the West. Certainly, these reform plans will not impact current situation, neither in Ukraine or in the Baltic region. They are headed towards future. And I would say that, I would dare to say that larger scale aggression against Lithuania and three Baltic states is unlikely in the short term. Of course, we cannot rule out anything, but military incidents at smaller scale, especially in time of war, nearby everything could happen. But simply for Russia is not able to open another larger front before reaching a long-standing and stable solution in Ukraine. So they have 90% of land capabilities in or around Ukraine, and in case of frozen conflict in Ukraine, any military adventure towards Baltics would make Russian military position in Ukraine fragile to possible counterattack. So Russia needs to find the solution in Ukraine before looking at other direction, and I fully share Sergei's view that Ukrainians are buying time for Lithuania, NATO, and Europe, and they're fighting for us, basically fighting for our security, not only Baltic security, for NATO security, for European security, paying with blood for our security. We must acknowledge that and recognize it. And the more successful Ukraine is in the battlefield, the more secure will Lithuania, Baltic states, and NATO be. It's obvious, at least from Lithuanians' perspective. And I think we should pay a big price for that, and Lithuania definitely does that, but we encourage other allies to follow our path as well. So what we are doing from national perspective, pure national perspective, I would say that we are enhancing national defense at the scale not seen after World War II in Europe. Not only Lithuania, but also I would say Latvia, Estonia, and Poland, at least. There is a awakening in other allies as well in Europe, but not at the same scale. So probably you know, if not, so we reinstated conscription actually after Russia occupied Crimea, annexed Crimea. So now we have peacetime armed forces, about 20,000 troops, and we are training rapidly our reserves. We increased our defense spending to 2.5 GDP. If I remember correctly, Canada spends about 1.3 only. And in absolute terms, we increased our defense expenditures 6 times over last decade. 6 times. So it's difficult to imagine such a number in, for example, Germany. So we are acquiring state-of-the-art national defense capabilities, medium-range air defense, long-range fire, self-propelled artillery, different types of drones. And we have ambition to have a division-sized force in the land domain. And again, referring back to this military problem, and as I mentioned earlier about the Suwalki corridor, our aim is very simple: to deter Russia in peacetime and to buy time for NATO reinforcement in crisis. War in Ukraine even accelerated this process, and I would say that I need to say that our society strongly supports such enhancing of national defense capabilities. Around 90% of Lithuanians are supporting NATO membership in NATO, and around 75% support allied military presence in Lithuania. These numbers are somewhat of the highest within the alliance. So we are very much pro-NATO. And Lithuania's military and humanitarian support to Ukraine is huge. For the size of the country, it's really huge. My country was the first to send air defense systems to Ukraine even before war. So we just showed an example for others. Afterwards, we donated artillery systems, ammunition, mortars, anti-tank capabilities, armored troop carriers, etc., etc. So I will not expand a lot about the military donations, because but perhaps I will talk a little bit more what society does, because it's not only a state-led endeavor, but also strongly supported and initiated and organized by civil organization, civil society. I can give just example of two initiatives. Last year Lithuanians raised 5 million euros for combat drone Bayraktar in just 3 days, and this year we raised 40 million euros for radars for Ukraine. Just these are just a fraction of what civil society is doing, and if you take the size of population into account, ignoring the fact that Canada is a much richer country than Lithuania, it would be like 100 million Canadian dollars in 3 days for the drone, and almost 300 million for radars. So it's a huge contribution. As I said, these two initiatives constitute just a fraction of total support from our society coming to Ukraine. I've just checked before our meeting one website of probably the most visible civil organization donating only military. They focus on military equipment to Ukraine, and they delivered so far delivered equipment worth of 50 million euro to Ukraine. Again, it would be 700 million Canadian dollars. But it's just one organization, as I said, and focusing only on military. So that's for what we are doing nationally. And now I will focus a little bit more on NATO's policy. I would say that, and we should acknowledge that fact, that since the beginning of war, NATO has demonstrated unity, resolve to defend allies, and enabled allies to provide huge military support to Ukraine. I would say that Putin didn't expect all these consequences. He betted probably that NATO will be divided over gas, etc., and he didn't expect such strong decisions by NATO leaders and by many countries, actually. NATO as an organization, NATO support, practical support to Ukraine is very limited. NATO basically functions as insurance for other allies, as a security umbrella for other allies and enable allies to support Ukraine individually. And for example, even for Lithuania, it's a very difficult national decision. When the war is when Russia is waging a large-scale war just nearby, we donate equipment from our storage facilities, like very sensitive military equipment, and to some extent we weaken our capabilities for at least in short term. So, but being part of NATO, we could take a risk. And Serhiy talked already about this reconquering strategy by NATO. And I talked about Kaliningrad and the Baltic corridor. So I would say that significant NATO's military presence in the Baltic states is at the heart of our national defense strategy. I joined the MOD, like 20 years ago, and I remember it's a long-term strategy. We had different governments, but it's a very national position. We can argue regarding the tactics, how to achieve it, but we do not argue about the strategic aim. So the idea is to prevent the problem of Suwalki corridor and Russian threat in general, to send a strong signal to Russia, and the boots on the ground send very strong deterrent signal to Russia. You cannot, if you do not have boots on the ground, if let's imagine the case there are no NATO troops in Baltic states, Russia could take a risk. Perhaps NATO, like in crisis, may not be willing to take strong decisions and risk lives of their troops, in Baltic states. Now, its station is different. When you have NATO troops in Baltic states, when the operation becomes more riskier, like you can maybe numbers not huge, but you're more or less sure that Berlin, Paris, London, Washington will not take lightly any losses of their troops in Baltic states. And just for your curiosity, I remember in NATO discussions even before the invasion, so Lithuania was among both countries who supported strongly NATO exercises in Ukraine. But we know how it ended, and some allies were not willing to take risks, and there was an approach. Some allies, we didn't believe that the invasion will realize. They even guessed that Putin is just threatening not only Ukraine and the West, and if we should avoid escalating the crisis. Of course, they were wrong. So, talking about more about the NATO military presence, so NATO fighter jets have been securing airspace of Baltic states since 2004. I remember I was responsible for that issue in MOD from the beginning, and that was indeed a strong signal. And basically, everything was orchestrated in a such manner that the minute Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia joined NATO, formally, legally, the NATO air policing mission in the Baltic states started. Basically, all this orchestrated to do it at the same minute. And another important step was taken in 2016 when NATO decided to deploy enhanced forward presence battalions to the Baltic states and Poland. US is a framework nation in Poland, Germany in Lithuania, UK in Estonia, and Canada in Latvia. And it's an enormous contribution to the Baltic security, and especially for Canada, which has to supply troops in Latvia over Atlantic Ocean. It takes much more efforts for Canada to have enhanced forward presence in Latvia than for many other allies in Europe. We should acknowledge that it's indeed a significant contribution, and it's a long-term contribution. It's a really great endeavor by Canada.
Rimas, I'm glad that you mentioned the Canadian forward troops in eastern part of Latvia. I have a couple questions for you and for Serhei, 2 or 3 of them. But before I do that, I wanted to take up that topic of the Suwałki gap between Belarus and Kaliningrad. Earlier, you mentioned that you have a map or an image. Are you able to share that on the screen? We'd welcome that if you can, if you have that image. Desktop.
Yeah, I have a map, but I get a message that host disabled participant screen sharing. So I'm disabled by you, I guess.
We can change that.
So please change it. I can put it on the screen.
Okay, we can change that. Yeah, based on my experience in Lithuania, I remember being at the Vilnius train station and thinking about how would I catch a train to Minsk within a matter of minutes, really. I didn't have a visa to enter Belarus, and certainly couldn't or wouldn't probably now, but that shows the presence of Belarus. And you're right when you talk about the boss of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. That gap, I know I've driven there 3 or 4 times into Poland and back, and so yeah, we're talking about what, a 50 or 60 mile 50 or 60 mile gap. You can see the corridor there. Thanks for sharing that. That's great. That tells it all. Unfortunately, when the Red Army Soviet troops reached what was formerly German territory, which was known as East Prussia, an agreement at or towards the end of the war ceded that area to the Soviet Union, and so it's remained part of Russia. Sergei may have something to say about the presence or the origins of that isolated Kaliningrad area, which serves a military function there. Thanks for that map. That's great. Somebody has posed a very good question here by the name of Roger about the Russian population, Russian ethnic population in Estonia, Lithuania, and particularly Latvia. I can speak to that, but I'd rather have you both speak to that. And in particular, the measures that Latvia most outstandingly took to deal with that fact of the ethnic Russian population, which was a product of the post-war period under Soviet control of the three Baltic nations, when citizens from the Russian Federation of the Soviet Union were encouraged to move into the Baltic Soviet republics as they were then. Anyone want to take up that question? And we can take the map off the screen now, I think, if you can. Thank you. Who would like to take up the question of ethnic Russians in the three Baltic republics to respond to what Roger has raised in the question area?
I can make a comment about how it worked out in Ukraine, and that would actually be an explanation of sorts of what the possibilities are. Because in Ukraine, there is a very, very significant number of ethnic Russians, but they do not live compactly other than in the Crimea. And they were not politically mobilized as Russians other than in the Crimea. So in the Crimea in the 1990s, the process of political and cultural mobilization took place, equating Russian cultural identity and Russian ethnic identity with the idea of being part of the Russian world. So it was relatively easy then to mobilize politically this entire group. And I could go on for a long time about the Crimea, but here's the point. Mr. Putin had assumed that the moment he invades, all other ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine would welcome his tanks. But that did not happen. And the reason here is that they were not politically mobilized during the recent decades a lot around the project of somehow joining Russia or returning to Russia. And instead, a great many of them were mobilized politically as Ukrainians, even if they speak Russian, but they mobilized in support of the European idea and joining Europe. And that is the nature of Mr. Putin's miscalculation, but it also tells us something about ethnic Russians residing in other countries. If they happen to be politically mobilized, if the country has to deal with the issue of compactly settled and politically mobilized Russian population, then it is a serious security risk. If, however, they are not, and they value the citizenship, if they have one, of the host republic, then it is a different matter. That's just a short comment.
Okay. Rimas, anything on the ethnic Russian population in the three Baltic countries? I know in Latvia in particular, since independence, Latvia took measures to deal with that consideration.
Lithuania's case is different. We have, I see that somebody answered already that Russians are a very small minority in Lithuania. I think it's 5 or 6% only. So it's a different story. Latvia's and Estonia's case is of course different. I could go deeper into that. I was participating in many seminars with Latvians, Estonians about this problem or challenge, I would say. But because Estonia's case and Latvia's case they're totally different. You know, like in Estonia, for example, a Russian minority is totally isolated in all matters, geographical, cultural, etc., etc. In Latvia, it's much more blended society. I would not, if I was Putin, I would not assume, you know, like that Estonian or Russian population would so much would go for Russia in case of conflict, would side to Russia. You know, I think the example of Ukraine shows, you know, very clearly that it's difficult to make such an assessment, and especially in the Baltic states. And for example, like Estonians are telling the story when there is a city Narva in which basically divided between Estonia and Russia. And Estonian Russians could easily go to Narva and see what is happening there, how it looks like, how people live there, etc. And the difference is very huge, and it's even accepting. So for them, it's more or less clear. So they are not the same Russians. My argument would be neither in Estonia nor in Latvia. There are lots of mixed families in Latvia as well. So of course, numbers, for example, regarding the membership in NATO are different in Latvia and Estonia comparing to Lithuania, but still a huge majority of population supports Latvia's and Estonia's membership in NATO.
Right. I think Sergei makes an excellent point in his book that I recommend to everybody, which is called Ukraine, What Everyone Needs to Know, that ethnic or particularly language affiliations, mother tongues, do not correspond to levels of political mobilization in favor of Russia or away from civic loyalties to Ukraine. I have a really important question that often comes up that I want to throw out to both of you, that I hear from certain analysts, commentators who may be in a minority, and that is the argument that, to put it bluntly, NATO started it, that Russia's reaction to what they feel is NATO encroachment and NATO aggression, as it were, and that Russia is simply adopting a defensive posture as a result of NATO encroachment on Russia. What do you make of that argument? How would you deal with that argument that NATO started it? And I think it's important to keep in mind that, as Sergei has reminded us, that Russian moves go way back, not just to 2014 in Crimea, but earlier in Chechnya and elsewhere in the southern part of the former Soviet Union in the 90s and early 2000s. Who would like to tackle that argument about that it's basically NATO's fault?
I can start very quickly. Of course, NATO didn't make Mr. Putin to kill oppositional politicians or journalists or poison them or imprison them. There is an inner trajectory of Mr. Putin's regime which is not defined by any external factors whatsoever. And in the Ukrainian case, there was no majority support for joining NATO, actually, in Ukraine. The holdover, all this old Soviet concept that the evil NATO is behind every bad thing in the world, was still very much present in Ukrainian society. And so majority support in Ukraine for joining NATO actually only materialized after Mr. Putin's attack. So here, as in other situations, kind of he, should have been careful what he wished for. And really, NATO didn't encourage Ukraine. After the discussion in 2008 about the potential membership for Georgia and Ukraine, when Germany and France vetoed the notion of ever accepting these two republics, it was not considered, at least according to what I hear from Canadian diplomats and such. It was not made public at the time who actually vetoed the notion of Ukraine and Georgia potentially joining NATO. But eventually suggestions made it into the press. And when you deal with two such major European members as France and Germany, Mr. Putin should have been sitting quietly, because, if major players in the NATO were not prepared to invite Ukraine, then NATO is not particularly aggressive in that particular part of the world. But of course, you realize that this is all Russian propaganda. It needs to be taken for what it is.
Okay, thank you, Remus.
I think Russian elite even doesn't believe such a story. You recommend to read Sergei's books. I definitely join this recommendation. But I would also recommend to read the famous Putin article of historian Putin as a historian of just before the invasion, and he quite openly stated that Ukraine should be part of Russia. So it's a typical imperialistic approach that you should conquer this territory as a lost territory. The military means if necessary, and all the rest is just a propaganda. It's more or less like that. And in the end, as a result of this war, Russia has more NATO along the borders, as Finland has already joined, and most probably Sweden will follow soon. So, and they are not very even aggressive about that, even rhetorically, although they have more NATO near the border. So he just fixated around Ukraine, and he wants to conquer Ukraine as such. And it's a typical imperialistic country with typical imperialistic policy that we've seen for ages, basically. And all the rest is just rhetorics.
Okay. Thank you. I have a question here from Kazimierz, Lithuanian Canadian community, the national organization. And what he says is, the war in Ukraine is long-term. United States politicians are getting tired of the war in Ukraine. If the political climate changes next year and a Trump-style president is elected, what will this do to their leadership of NATO? Good question. Comments?
Maybe I start again.
Sure.
Ironically, no, I share this concern. That's a very valid concern. Ironically, Trump was not a bad president when it came to supporting Ukraine. He was actually the one who started sending lethal weapons to Ukraine. The Obama administration was procrastinating forever, trying to calculate whether it can be done or cannot be done, and what people are going to say and what Putin is going to say.
True.
It was Trump who said, sure, let's send the weapons. And javelins, like the most important weapon for the early stage of the war, when the Russian armor moved into Ukraine in large quantities, was in fact sent by Mr. Trump, his administration. Now, Mr. Trump is of course unpredictable. So we don't quite know what he would do if elected again. The noises he makes may well be part of the campaign against the Biden administration, but of course it may turn out to be his policy. I do have a hope that this would not happen, because Trump, like Putin and like some other presidents, has this, macho style leadership, in which you cannot lose your face. You always have to look like the strongest alpha leader in the group. So Trump would be very vulnerable to the critique of selling out to Putin and reducing American greatness by basically making Russia great. So the moment such critique emerges, he would have to walk back right away and say, no, 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 I'm all for the American interests and I'm not for the Russian interests. And also, I think Mr. Putin is going to make it difficult for him. Because,
Right.
yeah, Putin is not actually going to make America great again. He has a different game. And so I can see Trump trying to translate his critique of Biden's administration and his strange promises to solve everything in 24 hours, but he can just as easily abandon them and say, well, you know, the American military is the greatest in the world, not the Russian military. And he was the one who sent the javelins. So I think Trump is unpredictable, and for that reason, I wouldn't worry all that much at this point. But who knows what's going to happen?
And who knows if he will, although it seems likely now, win the nomination by the Republican Party for the presidential contest.
I think
much
he
harder
will.
line in
Yeah, I
Ukraine
think
has
he
been
will.
indicated by a second leading candidate. Remus, would you like to add anything about that? United States?
Actually, very difficult to speculate what could be the policy of future US administration that could apply to European, future European governments as well, you know, especially for host countries for which, you know, Russia is not an existential threat. So it's difficult to forecast. But looking from American perspective, I would say that it's, that US, they feel that China is more or less becoming the major threat for United States, but still they have to invest into European security to somehow to add Europe and have a stable another corner of the world, you know. So for them, looking from their perspective, it doesn't matter whether you are Republican or Democrat, whether you're Trump or whatever candidate. It's to support Ukraine militarily and to kill Russians in Ukraine and to solve the European problem. It's the cheapest way actually to support Ukraine militarily. And if you are able to weaken Russia by the hands of Ukrainians, you can then concentrate on China. So that's why Americans are so eager to support militarily Ukraine, because they expect that they will weaken Russia to the extent that Europeans could deal with Russia.
Right.
So that's also a strong argument in the United States.
Right. Thanks. We've hit 11 Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern North American time, and you're 9 hours away in Brussels, Remus. I wonder if there are other questions or comments left in the next couple of minutes, the next few minutes that we can wind up on. You can either post them in the chat, or we can get you unmuted, or you can unmute yourself and pose that if our guests are willing to stay on for another couple of minutes. Okay, I want to close by thanking our speakers, Professor Serhii Yekelchik, University of Victoria, and again, recommend to everybody the short but very incisive book on Ukraine that he has, Ukraine, What Everyone Needs to Know, in addition to his more scholarly work on Soviet Ukraine under Stalin and thereafter. Thank you, Serhii. I would like to thank Remus as well. I know he has a very busy life. I know that through a colleague of yours here in Vancouver, with your family and so on. I know you're very busy at NATO in Brussels and probably preparing for a July meeting there. So I just want to say how much I appreciate your presence here, and we moved around the time to this perhaps early hour on a weekend so that you wouldn't have to get up at 4 or 5 in the morning in Brussels to deal with us. So I appreciate you being here. Any final comments? I see a hand here from Christina Yarlis. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Jean. I may have missed it in the presentations because I had to step away for a brief moment, but I recall that Rimas Ališauskas, I think you gave us a teaser right at the beginning of your talk, and you mentioned you were going to answer the big question on many people's minds who have ties to the Baltics about the potential chances of either an annexation or military activity close or around our borders. Were you, and if you answered it, I apologize, but I wanted to see if you might touch on that once again.
No, I didn't answer, but how to say, it was both a joke and a serious thing. And my answer would be very simple. I can assure you that war will be fought in Lithuania. I'm 100% sure. The only thing I don't know, and I can tell you, is the time. Even it's in 10 years, in 50 years, or 100 years, Unlikely in the near future, but we cannot rule out anything in longer term. So my message was that we should be ready for that, and we should work in NATO and enhance our deterrence defense to send the message to Russia that it would be impossible to win this war against our Baltic states against NATO. So, and Canada plays a very significant role into that, especially in Latvia, so for our security and not to have war, but generally, people fighting, for thousands of years, and especially in this part of Europe. So nobody will change. I'm pessimist in this regard, but I'm optimist about the near future.
Okay. Thanks. I hope to be optimistic, but we shall see. As you say, it's unpredictable, as Sergei said about future American politics as well. So I'd like to finish by thanking again the speakers and wish you all a good day, and thanks for all the participants for joining this. We've been recording it, and we hope to find a way to let attendees know that we can post it. So we'll let you know. Or you can reach the Lithuanian community of British Columbia, both Facebook and website. So have a good morning, good afternoon, good night, depending on where you are. And thanks again. We shall see you later. Stay in good health, and bye for now.